The helicopter blades chopped through the thick Afghan air as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison checked his equipment one final time. His SEAL unit, callsign Trident 7, was heading into hostile territory near the Pakistan border. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target was hiding in a mountain compound, and Morrison's team had been tasked with a capture or kill mission. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos sat in the corner of the aircraft, her sniper rifle secured beside her. She wasn't officially part of Morrison's unit, but had been attached as their designated marksman for this operation. The other SEALs had initially questioned having a female operator on their team, but Santos had proven herself countless times in Iraq and Afghanistan. Her kill record spoke louder than any doubts they might have harbored. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon looked ominous. Weather reports had warned of severe thunderstorms moving through the region, but command decided the mission was too important to delay. Morrison studied the satellite images one more time, memorizing every detail of the compound's layout. 3 buildings surrounded by high walls with guard towers on each corner. Chief Petty Officer Danny Rodriguez, the team's explosives expert, was running final checks on his demolition charges. Next to him, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Mike Chen organized his medical supplies while communications specialist Tom Bradley tested the radio equipment. The 6th member of their team, Petty Officer First Class Alex Turner, cleaned his assault rifle with practiced precision. As they approached the landing zone, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 30 seconds to touchdown. Weather's getting rough out here, gentlemen. You might want to wrap this up quick. Morrison gave his team the signal to prepare for insertion. They had trained for this mission dozens of times, but something felt different tonight. The intelligence seemed too clean, too perfect. In his 12 years as a SEAL, Morrison had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. The helicopter touched down in a clearing about 2 kilometers from the target compound. As the team moved out, Santos took point with her rifle, scanning the terrain through her night vision scope. The mountains loomed around them like sleeping giants, and the only sounds were their boots on the rocky ground and the distant rumble of thunder. They moved through the darkness with practiced silence, each man knowing his role without need for communication. Santos found herself impressed by their coordination, despite her being the newcomer to their unit. She had worked with many special operations teams, but few moved with the fluid precision of Morrison's SEALs. The compound came into view just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Morrison called for a halt and pulled out his binoculars. The guard towers appeared empty, which immediately raised red flags. Where were the sentries that intelligence had reported? The main building showed minimal light, and there was no movement visible anywhere within the compound walls. Santos set up her rifle on a rocky outcrop that provided an excellent view of the entire target area. Through her scope, she confirmed Morrison's observations. The place looked deserted, but her training told her that appearances could be deadly in this line of work. Rodriguez moved forward to reconnoiter the perimeter wall, while Chen and Bradley took overwatch positions. Turner stayed with Morrison as they planned their approach. The original plan called for Santos to provide sniper support from her elevated position, while the team breached the compound, but the lack of visible targets was concerning. As they prepared to move closer, Santos noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through her thermal scope, she could see heat signatures moving inside what appeared to be empty buildings, lots of them. This wasn't the small cell they had been briefed about. This looked like a full company of fighters, at least 40 to 50 men. She immediately radioed Morrison with her observation. His response was grim but unsurprising. They had walked into a trap, but they were already committed to the mission. Calling for extraction now would mean admitting failure and potentially losing valuable intelligence about future operations in the region. The rain began falling harder, and the thunder grew louder. Santos wiped the moisture from her scope and settled into her shooting position. Whatever happened next, she would be ready to provide cover for her team. In the distance, lightning illuminated the mountain peaks, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this storm would be the least of their problems before the night was over. Morrison made the decision to proceed, despite Santos's warning about the heat signatures. They had come too far to turn back now, and intelligence might be wrong about the numbers. His team had faced worse odds before and lived to tell about it. The SEALs moved toward the compound wall in a tactical formation, with Rodriguez taking point to plant charges on the main gate. The rain was now coming down steadily, which would help mask the sound of their approach but also make visibility more challenging. Santos watched through her scope as her teammates became ghostly figures moving through the downpour. Just as Rodriguez reached the wall, all hell broke loose. Muzzle flashes erupted from every window and rooftop in the compound. The empty guard towers suddenly came alive with machine gun fire. Morrison's team had walked straight into a carefully planned ambush. "Contact! Contact!" Bradley's voice screamed through the radio as bullets peppered the ground around the seals. Morrison immediately ordered his men to take cover behind a series of large rocks near the compound entrance. Santos didn't hesitate. Her rifle barked 3 times in rapid succession, and 3 muzzle flashes in the compound went dark. She had identified the biggest threats and eliminated them within seconds. But for every fighter she dropped, 2 more seemed to take their place. Rodriguez had been caught in the open when the shooting started. A bullet tore through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing behind a concrete barrier. Chen immediately began crawling toward him under heavy fire, his medical bag clutched against his chest. Morrison realized they were pinned down with no clear escape route. The compound had been turned into a fortress, with interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible avenue of approach or retreat. Worse yet, he could hear vehicles approaching from the valley below. Reinforcements were arriving, and his team would soon be completely surrounded. Turner's rifle jammed just as a group of insurgents tried to flank their position from the right. He cleared the malfunction quickly, but not before several rounds came uncomfortably close to his head. The enemy had superior numbers, better positions, and the advantage of prepared defenses. Santos continued picking off targets, but she was running low on ammunition. Each shot had to count now. She focused on the leaders, trying to disrupt their coordination and buy her teammates time to find a way out of their desperate situation. Bradley was frantically calling for helicopter extraction while returning fire with his carbine. The pilot's response was not encouraging. The storm had intensified, with lightning now striking the mountain peaks regularly. Flying in these conditions would be suicide for any aircraft crew. Chen reached Rodriguez and began treating his wound while bullets cracked overhead. The shoulder injury was serious but not life-threatening if they could get him proper medical attention soon. Rodriguez was still conscious and trying to return fire despite the pain. Morrison assessed their tactical situation and realized they had only one option left. They needed to break contact and find a defensible position where they could wait out the storm and call for extraction. But moving from their current cover would expose them to devastating fire from the compound. The sound of diesel engines grew louder as trucks full of enemy fighters approached from multiple directions. Santos could see their headlights bouncing along the mountain road through her scope. Time was running out fast. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the rocks near Turner's position, showering him with stone fragments and temporarily blinding him with smoke and debris. The enemy was bringing heavier weapons into the fight now. Santos made a quick ammunition count and found she had only 12 rounds left. She would have to make each shot eliminate multiple targets or find some way to create maximum disruption with minimum expenditure. Looking at the approaching vehicles, she had an idea that might give her teammates the distraction they needed. The storm continued to build in intensity, with thunder now drowning out the sound of gunfire between strikes. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the rocky ground into treacherous mud. Lightning illuminated the battlefield in stark, terrifying detail every few seconds. Morrison knew his team couldn't hold their position much longer. The enemy was methodically working their way closer, using covering fire to advance by bounds. Soon they would be close enough to use grenades effectively, and that would be the end of Trident 7. Santos lined up her shot on the lead truck's fuel tank as it navigated the winding mountain road. The vehicle was still 800 meters away, but she had made more difficult shots in worse conditions. She controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger just as lightning illuminated the valley. The truck exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the entire mountainside. The vehicle behind it swerved to avoid the wreckage and plunged off the narrow road, rolling down the steep slope in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The explosion had the desired effect. Enemy fighters in the compound momentarily stopped shooting to look at the destruction. Morrison seized the opportunity and ordered his team to move. They bounded from rock to rock, covering each other as they worked their way toward a more defensible position higher up the mountainside. Rodriguez, despite his wounded shoulder, kept pace with the others while Chen stayed close to provide medical support. Turner's vision was gradually clearing from the RPG blast, but he was having trouble hearing commands over the ringing in his ears. Bradley grabbed his arm and guided him toward their new position while maintaining suppressing fire with his carbine. The insurgents in the compound quickly recovered from their surprise and resumed their assault with renewed intensity. They had realized their prey was trying to escape and concentrated their fire on the retreating SEALs. Santos provided covering fire as her teammates moved, dropping 2 more fighters who had exposed themselves while trying to get better angles on the fleeing Americans. But her elevated position was becoming increasingly dangerous as the enemy began to focus their attention on her muzzle flashes. A sniper's bullet cracked past her head, missing by inches. Santos immediately shifted positions, moving 30 meters to the left before setting up again. Counter-sniper operations were a deadly game of cat and mouse, and she knew her opponent was skilled. Morrison led his team toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide better cover and concealment. The rain was now falling so hard that visibility was reduced to less than 50 meters, which helped mask their movement but also made it difficult to see threats. As they reached the boulder field, Rodriguez stumbled and fell. The blood loss from his shoulder wound was starting to affect him, and the rough terrain wasn't helping. Chen quickly moved to his side and began administering IV fluids to combat the shock. Bradley established communication with their support aircraft, but the news wasn't good. The storm was too severe for helicopter extraction, and the nearest ground support was over 2 hours away. They were on their own until the weather cleared. Turner's hearing was slowly returning, and he took up a position covering their back trail. Through his night vision goggles, he could see muzzle flashes moving through the rain as enemy fighters began pursuing them up the mountain. Santos realized her position on the original ridge was no longer tenable. Enemy fire was getting too accurate, and she needed to link up with the rest of the team. She began a careful withdrawal, moving from cover to cover while maintaining overwatch on the pursuing insurgents. A mortar round exploded 20 meters from Morrison's position, showering the SEALs with mud and rock fragments. The enemy had brought indirect fire weapons into play, which meant they could attack the Americans even when hidden behind solid cover. Morrison made the tactical decision to continue climbing higher up the mountain, hoping to find terrain that would favor the defenders. The insurgents would have to funnel through narrow approaches, making them easier targets for Santos when she rejoined the team. The sound of diesel engines echoed through the valley as more vehicles arrived at the compound. Santos could see their lights through the rain as she moved toward her teammate's position. The enemy was bringing in substantial reinforcements, turning this from a small firefight into a major engagement. Chen finished stabilizing Rodriguez's condition and reported to Morrison that they could continue moving, but slowly. The wounded SEAL needed surgery soon, but he was stable enough for now. Every minute they stayed in one place increased the risk of being surrounded. Another mortar round impacted closer to their position, followed by 2 more in rapid succession. The enemy was walking their fire up the mountainside, trying to bracket the Americans' location. Morrison ordered his team to move immediately, before the mortars found their range. Santos was still 200 meters away when she saw the mortar impacts near her teammates. She began moving faster, abandoning some of her stealth for speed. Her team needed her firepower, and every second counted now. The storm reached its full fury as the SEALs climbed through the boulder field. Lightning strikes were hitting the mountain peaks regularly, and the thunder was so loud it temporarily drowned out all other sounds. The rain had turned every surface into a slippery hazard. Morrison found a defensive position among the boulders that offered good fields of fire and protection from the mortars. The rocks formed a natural fortress with multiple escape routes if they needed to withdraw further up the mountain. He positioned his men to cover all the likely approaches while they waited for Santos to reach them. The pursuing insurgents were making good time despite the difficult terrain and weather conditions. Through their night vision equipment, the SEALs could see dozens of fighters working their way up the mountainside in small groups, trying to surround their position. Santos was moving as quickly as possible across the treacherous ground, but the rain-slicked rocks made every step dangerous. She slipped and fell hard, her rifle clattering against the stones. For a moment she was stunned and gasping for breath, but she forced herself to get up and continue moving. Turner spotted movement to their right flank and opened fire with his rifle. His shots illuminated 3 insurgents who had been trying to work around behind their position. 2 went down immediately, but the third managed to scramble behind cover and began returning fire. Chen was monitoring Rodriguez's condition while preparing for the inevitable casualties that would come from the approaching assault. His medical supplies were limited, and he was already concerned about their ability to handle multiple serious wounds in these conditions. Bradley maintained contact with headquarters, providing updates on their tactical situation and requesting immediate air support despite the weather. Command acknowledged their transmissions but couldn't promise when help would arrive. The storm was grounding all aircraft across the region. A group of insurgents made a coordinated rush toward the SEALs' position from 3 different directions. Morrison and his men opened fire simultaneously, creating a devastating crossfire that stopped the attack cold, but they had expended significant ammunition in the process. Santos finally reached the boulder field and began working her way toward her teammates' position. She could hear the intense firefight ahead and knew she needed to get into the action quickly. Her sniper rifle would be crucial in breaking up enemy assault formations. Another mortar barrage impacted around their position, this time much more accurate than before. One round exploded just 10 meters away, sending deadly fragments whistling through the air. Turner cried out as shrapnel tore through his left leg, but he continued fighting from his position. Morrison realized they were facing a well-coordinated enemy force with professional military training. These weren't typical insurgent fighters. They moved with discipline and used proper small unit tactics. Someone with serious military experience was commanding this operation. Santos reached the team's defensive perimeter, just as another wave of attackers began their assault. She immediately set up her rifle and began engaging targets at long range, dropping fighters before they could get close enough to use their assault rifles effectively. The storm continued to rage above them, with lightning strikes coming closer to their position. The metallic components of their weapons and equipment made them vulnerable to electrical strikes, but they had no choice except to continue fighting. Chen crawled over to treat Turner's leg wound while bullets cracked overhead. The shrapnel had caused significant tissue damage, but Turner refused morphine that would impair his ability to fight. He continued engaging targets despite the pain. Rodriguez, despite his shoulder wound, was still contributing to the defense with his pistol from a covered position. Every shot counted now, and wounded or not, he wasn't going to let his teammates down. Bradley received a transmission that made Morrison's blood run cold. Intelligence reports indicated that a full company of foreign fighters had been moved into the area, specifically to target American Special Operations Forces. This entire operation had been a trap from the beginning. Santos noticed that the enemy was beginning to coordinate their attacks more effectively. They were using covering fire and movement techniques that suggested professional military training. These weren't local insurgents. They were experienced foreign fighters who knew how to fight Americans. The mortar fire intensified, with rounds now impacting in a pattern that suggested the enemy had precise coordinates for their position. Morrison made the difficult decision that they needed to abandon their current location and find new cover before they were all killed. Turner struggled to his feet despite his leg wound, determined not to slow down his teammates during their withdrawal. Chen helped support him while carrying his medical equipment and maintaining his rifle at the ready position. Santos provided covering fire as the team began moving to a new position higher up the mountain. Her accurate shots kept the enemy fighters pinned down long enough for her teammates to bound from cover to cover up the steep slope. The rain was now coming down in torrents, making every step treacherous on the rocky terrain. Lightning strikes were hitting the mountain peaks every few seconds, creating an almost constant rumble of thunder that made voice communication nearly impossible. The new position Morrison selected was a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside by centuries of erosion. It offered excellent visibility down the slope, but had only one escape route, straight up an almost vertical cliff face. They were trading mobility for a better defensive position, gambling that they could hold this ground until extraction arrived. Santos set up her rifle at the edge of the ledge, using the natural stone parapet for support. From this elevated position, she could see the entire battlefield below. The insurgents were regrouping after their failed assault, but she could count at least 60 muzzle flashes spread across the mountainside. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was getting worse. Lightning strikes were now hitting the mountain every few seconds, and the thunder was so continuous that it created a constant background roar. The rain had turned into a waterfall cascading down the cliff faces. Turner was struggling with his leg wound despite Chen's field treatment. The shrapnel had damaged muscle tissue, making it difficult for him to maintain a stable shooting position. But he gritted his teeth and continued engaging targets, knowing his teammates needed every rifle in the fight. Rodriguez had stopped bleeding from his shoulder wound, but he was showing signs of shock from blood loss. Chen monitored his vital signs while preparing defensive positions, ready to provide medical attention to anyone who got hit in the next assault. Bradley established communication with a B-1 bomber that had been diverted to their area despite the weather conditions. The air crew was willing to attempt a bombing run on the compound below, but they needed precise coordinates and assurance that no friendlies were in the target area. Morrison coordinated with Santos to mark targets for the airstrike, while his men prepared for what would likely be the enemy's final assault before the bombers arrived. They had to hold this position for at least 15 more minutes. The insurgents began their attack with a concentrated mortar barrage that walked up the mountainside toward the SEALs' position. Morrison's team pressed themselves against the cliff face as explosions shook the entire ledge. Rock fragments rained down on them like deadly hail. Santos spotted the enemy mortar position through her scope and put 2 rounds into the crew before they could adjust their fire. The explosions stopped abruptly, giving the SEALs a brief respite from the indirect fire threat. 3 separate assault groups began climbing toward their position simultaneously. The enemy commander was trying to divide the Americans' fire and overwhelm them through sheer numbers. Morrison assigned each of his men specific sectors of fire to ensure complete coverage of the approaches. Turner opened fire on the leftmost group of attackers, his rifle barking steadily despite the pain in his leg. His shots were accurate, dropping multiple fighters and forcing the others to seek cover among the rocks below. Chen split his attention between treating wounded teammates and engaging targets with his carbine. As the team's medic, he wasn't primarily a rifleman, but years of combat experience had made him deadly accurate with his weapon. Rodriguez used his pistol to engage targets that got too close to their position. His shoulder wound limited his ability to use a rifle effectively, but the compact handgun allowed him to contribute to the defense while conserving his strength. Santos systematically engaged the most dangerous targets, focusing on enemy fighters who carried heavy weapons or appeared to be leaders coordinating the assault. Each of her shots eliminated a significant threat to her teammates' survival. Bradley coordinated the incoming airstrike while returning fire with his carbine. The bomber crew was approaching their target despite the dangerous weather conditions, but they needed constant updates on enemy positions to avoid hitting the Americans. A lucky mortar round exploded just below the ledge, sending a shower of rock fragments across their position. Turner took more shrapnel in his right arm but continued fighting, blood streaming down his sleeve as he worked the bolt of his rifle. Morrison realized they were down to their last magazines of ammunition. Each shot would have to count now, and they couldn't afford to miss or waste rounds on suppression fire. It was becoming a matter of mathematical precision. Could they eliminate enough attackers before running out of bullets? The enemy assault intensified as fighters realized the Americans were running low on ammunition. They became more aggressive, exposing themselves for longer periods as they closed in on the ledge position. Santos made every round count, dropping targets with single shots to the head or chest. Her marksmanship was keeping multiple assault groups pinned down, but she was down to her last few cartridges. The sound of jet engines became audible over the thunder as the B-1 bomber approached the target area. Bradley provided final coordinates while the team prepared to take cover from their own airstrike. The B-1 bomber made its approach through the storm, fighting severe turbulence and limited visibility. The pilot had to rely entirely on GPS coordinates provided by Bradley, as the weather made visual identification impossible. One mistake could kill both the enemy fighters and the American team. Bradley gave the final cleared hot call and ordered his teammates to take cover. The bomber crew released their payload, a string of precision-guided munitions that would devastate the compound. Below, while leaving the SEALs' mountain position, untouched, the explosions lit up the entire valley like daylight for several seconds. The compound where the ambush had originated disappeared in a series of massive fireballs that could be seen for miles despite the storm. The concussion waves rolled up the mountainside, shaking loose rocks and temporarily deafening everyone. But the airstrike hadn't eliminated all the threats. Many insurgent fighters had been operating outside the compound when the bombs hit, and they were still climbing toward the SEALs' position. Morrison counted at least 20 muzzle flashes still moving up the mountainside through the smoke and flames. Santos had 3 rounds left in her rifle and no spare magazines. She made each shot count, targeting enemy fighters who posed the greatest immediate threat to her teammates. Her first round dropped a fighter carrying an RPG launcher. Her second eliminated a man with a light machine gun. Turner's rifle had jammed and he was having difficulty clearing the malfunction with his wounded right arm. Chen moved over to help him while continuing to engage targets with his own weapon. Time was running out as the enemy fighters got closer to their position. Rodriguez was fading from blood loss despite Chen's medical treatment. Morrison made the decision to use their last smoke grenade to obscure their position while they prepared for a final stand. The purple smoke mixed with the rain and lightning created an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. Bradley received word that a helicopter extraction team was finally airborne and fighting through the storm to reach them. But the aircraft was still 40 minutes away, and the enemy assault would reach their position in less than 5 minutes. Santos used her final rifle round to eliminate an insurgent who had climbed within 30 meters of their ledge. She then drew her sidearm and prepared for close-quarters combat. Her marksmanship had been crucial in keeping the team alive this long. But now it would come down to pistols and hand-to-hand fighting. Morrison distributed the last of their ammunition among his men and prepared for the final assault. Each SEAL had only a few rounds left and they would have to make every shot count. There was no room for error now. The first enemy fighters reached the base of the ledge and began climbing the final approach. Turner managed to clear his rifle malfunction and immediately engaged them at point-blank range. His shots echoed off the cliff walls as he dropped 2 attackers. Chen was torn between treating Rodriguez's worsening condition and fighting off the attackers. He made the difficult decision to focus on combat, knowing that everyone would die if they couldn't hold their position for a few more minutes. Santos moved to the most exposed position on the ledge, using her pistol to engage targets as they appeared over the edge. Her accuracy with the handgun was nearly as deadly as with her rifle, dropping multiple fighters who tried to gain a foothold on their defensive position. A grenade bounced onto the ledge and rolled toward Turner's position. Morrison threw himself on top of the explosive device, preparing to sacrifice himself to save his teammates. But the grenade was a dud, either damaged by the rain or defective from the start. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors became audible over the storm and gunfire. The extraction team was getting closer, but they still had to survive the next few minutes of intense combat while enemy fighters swarmed their position. Rodriguez summoned his remaining strength and began engaging targets with his pistol, determined not to let his teammates down despite his serious wounds. His shots were shaky but effective at the close ranges they were now fighting. Bradley coordinated with the incoming helicopters while fighting off attackers with his carbine. The pilots were having difficulty locating the SEALs' position in the storm and needed constant guidance to find the narrow ledge where they were trapped. Santos ran out of ammunition for her pistol and drew her combat knife as an insurgent fighter appeared at the edge of the ledge. The hand-to-hand combat was brief and brutal, ending with the enemy fighter tumbling back down the cliff face. Lightning struck the mountain peak directly above them, sending a shower of sparks and broken rock cascading down the cliff face. The electrical discharge temporarily blinded everyone and added to the chaos of the firefight. The rescue helicopters finally appeared through the storm, their searchlights cutting through the rain and smoke like bright swords. The lead pilot had to perform an incredibly dangerous maneuver, hovering just feet from the cliff face while his crew chief prepared fast rope equipment for extraction. Morrison's team was down to their last few rounds of ammunition when the helicopter's door gunner opened fire on the remaining insurgent fighters below their position. The heavy machine gun swept the mountainside, eliminating the immediate threats and buying precious time for the extraction. Santos helped carry Rodriguez toward the helicopter, while Turner provided covering fire despite his leg wound. Chen gathered his medical equipment and prepared to treat both wounded men during the flight back to base. The extraction would have to be fast. The helicopters couldn't maintain their position in these weather conditions for long. The crew chief lowered the rescue hoist while the pilot fought severe turbulence that threatened to slam the aircraft into the cliff face. Bradley went up first, followed by Rodriguez, who needed immediate medical attention. The wounded SEAL was barely conscious as they strapped him into the hoist. Turner insisted on going up next, despite Morrison's protests. As team leader, Morrison traditionally would be the last man extracted, but Turner's leg wound was bleeding heavily, and he needed medical treatment quickly. Santos helped secure him to the hoist as enemy muzzle flashes appeared again below their position. Chen followed Turner up to the helicopter, where he immediately began treating both wounded SEALs with the aircraft's advanced medical equipment. The crew chief was also trained as a paramedic and assisted with Rodriguez's blood transfusion, while Chen worked on Turner's shrapnel wounds. Santos was next on the hoist, but she refused to leave until Morrison was safely aboard. As the team's designated marksman, she felt responsible for covering their withdrawal and ensuring everyone made it out alive. Morrison argued briefly but then focused on providing security, while she prepared for extraction. The helicopter pilots were pushing their aircraft to its limits, fighting wind shear and lightning strikes that threatened to bring them down. Fuel consumption was higher than normal due to the extreme weather conditions, and they were approaching the point where they would have to abort the mission. A final group of insurgent fighters reached the ledge just as Santos was being lifted toward the helicopter. Morrison engaged them with his last magazine while the hoist pulled her up through the storm. His accurate fire kept the attackers pinned down long enough for the extraction to continue. Morrison was the last man on the ledge when the hoist came down for him. As he secured himself to the cable, an RPG round exploded against the cliff face just meters from his position. The concussion knocked him unconscious as the crew chief pulled him up toward safety. The helicopter immediately pulled away from the mountain as soon as Morrison was aboard. The pilots had pushed their fuel reserves to the absolute limit, and they needed to reach a forward operating base before running out of gas. Behind them, the storm continued to rage over the battlefield. Santos regained consciousness during the flight and immediately checked on her teammates' condition. Rodriguez was stable but would need surgery at a major medical facility. Turner's leg wound was serious but not life-threatening. Morrison had a concussion from the RPG blast but was otherwise uninjured. The debriefing later revealed that intelligence had been compromised, leading Trident 7 into a carefully planned trap. Foreign fighters with professional military training had been brought in specifically to target American Special Operations Forces. The mission had been a setup from the beginning, but the SEALs had survived against overwhelming odds through their training, teamwork, and the exceptional marksmanship of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos. Her precise shooting had eliminated over 20 enemy fighters and disrupted multiple assault formations throughout the battle. Morrison recommended Santos for the Silver Star for her actions during the firefight. Her accurate fire had been crucial in keeping the team alive until extraction arrived. The other SEALs, who had initially questioned having a female operator on their team, now considered her one of their own. Rodriguez and Turner both recovered fully from their wounds and returned to active duty within 6 months. Chen was promoted and assigned to train other special operations medics. Bradley received a commendation for his outstanding performance under fire while coordinating air support and extraction. The compound that had served as the ambush site was completely destroyed by the B-1 bomber strike. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 40 enemy fighters were killed in the air attack, significantly disrupting foreign fighter operations in the region for months afterward. Morrison continued leading SEAL operations in Afghanistan, but he never forgot the night when everything went wrong and his team had to fight for survival in a mountain storm. The mission became legendary within the special operations community as an example of what could be accomplished through superior training, unbreakable teamwork, and exceptional individual skill under the worst possible conditions.